Good morning, it's Rick Walters, and we're here again for another virtual session of adult education. Although our current study centers on the Apostle Paul, who is either appealing or appalling, and the video series of John Dominic Crossan regarding his studies of Paul, I want to go back to a theme that we discussed earlier in this series about equality in the Christian community that Paul spoke about, and how universal that theme really was to him and to the early church of his time. In the early church, there was an opportunity for people to gather from different walks of life. There were people who were slaves, who were women, who were of different backgrounds, from different social strata within the world. And the opportunity arose, as Paul saw it, for all people who gathered in a Christian community to be considered equal. It's interesting that when we talk about the letters of Paul, the authentic ones, as opposed to the interpreters of Paul in the later letters, that there was a contrast between the early letters, authentic letters of Paul, and these later letters. So for instance, in Timothy, we have the writer of those particular letters talking about women playing a reduced role in the life of the church, being silent. And this is contradicted by Paul and further evidence of the authenticity of his earlier letters when he appoints a deaconess, or really it was the word diakonia, meaning deacon, that was referring to either men or women leaders, early leaders, before there was such a thing as ministers, clergy, official priests of any kind. There were deacons. And these deacons were appointed by Paul or by the various churches to perform various roles of leadership. And so Paul appoints this deaconess named Phoebe, who he sends to Rome on his behalf, perhaps because he was in jail at the time, or because he wasn't ready yet to cross the sea and to visit Rome on his own. He sends Phoebe with the letter of Paul to the Romans. Yes, that same letter that appears in the New Testament and is considered to be one of the authentic letters of Paul. Well, Phoebe is sent by Paul to read that letter to the congregation of early Christian followers of Jesus in Rome, whatever kind of community that was and wherever they were meeting. And to read that letter to them, to interpret it to them, to answer their questions about it, and to be a representative of Paul himself. This was the vision of the role of women that he had at the time he wrote the letter to the Romans. So it's very unlikely that he would have espoused the opinion that was expressed later in Timothy about women keeping silent. That's just one little illustration of the thing that he was talking about when he talked about in Galatians that there was neither male nor female, that there was neither slave nor master, there was neither Jew nor Greek. He was talking about all being one in Christ and equal within that community. And that extended to making resources available for one another so that all in that community would have enough, just as a householder in an individual home would be providing for all the members of that particular household. And in fact, John Dominic Crossan does something very interesting in his book about the Lord's Prayer, saying that the concept of householder came first from his understanding of the Lord's Prayer as being the householder of the universe, of the world, God, God's self. So that God as the householder was providing for the whole community of the world of creation. And then you extend that to the family, where the head of the household, be it male or female, is providing for all the members of the household. And then he extends it one step further to the Christian community, meeting together as an early Christian community, usually in homes, that there was a householder present there as well. And perhaps it was these deacons or other persons who stepped up to provide leadership, but that Christ would be the unifying factor, the unifying householder, as you will, of that early community. But the same principles would apply, that it was the responsibility of the household to provide not specifically equal, but so that everyone at least had enough to have the same opportunities as each other. I think in a time like this, interpreting it for the kind of experience that we're going through right now, we can make another application. We can make an application that in providing services and care for one another during a pandemic, that there be equal treatment. For instance, in the conversations over the legislation passed by Congress to provide relief to persons suffering because of the pandemic, there was a big discussion about what is the placement of corporations versus individual working people, and whether the kind of relief that we would give to companies would be the same level of relief given to workers. And so in the CARE Act, interesting name that Congress would give to this legislation, the CARES Act, there is provision both for companies, but also for individual workers to provide unemployment benefits, to provide relief from certain taxes, to be able to borrow money, etc. And so that discussion about equality is such an ongoing discussion. It's not one that was solved by, let us say, the Civil War or solved by the civil rights legislation of the 60s or solved by the continuing legislation trying to bring about greater equality. No, it's an ongoing living process. And for us, it's also a matter of faith. That our faith teaches us about equality. And to think that Paul, all those years ago, was already reflecting about this concept of equality and freedom within that early community that he was most concerned about is something that brings refreshment to us in our current strife. So I think we need to reflect on these days about, is everyone getting an equal opportunity to have access to health care, to have access to resources that will assist them to get back on their feet? And how can we play a role in that as a community that cares about those who are one in Christ, as Paul said? Perhaps there are ways, virtually and non-virtually, for us to be involved in helping one another. I know that you've already been thinking about that and volunteering and doing things and checking up on people and offering prayers. But it's just good to know, I think, that related to the learning opportunities we've had to look back at the themes that Paul talked about in terms of the justice brought about by equality, it's good to know that that's a part of how our faith came about. And so we continue in this learning journey. We continue in our understanding of our role as Christians, just as the early Christians did. And we think about ways to bring about a greater sense of equality and justice in our own world, even in the midst, and particularly, perhaps, important in the midst of the times that we find ourselves in. So, until next time, we say goodbye and join us again when you are able. Thank you.